Hey, everybody. Welcome to history class. So, it's been a weird time, huh? Yeah, could not have predicted this. But anyway, as we make history, we need to keep studying history. Blah, blah, blah. So, I can't give you any tea today, obviously, but I would love to. And I really look forward to that when we're back in session. The homework for today, and the reason I keep looking down here, is because I have my notebook with all the answers. And I've been checking your homework as you've been submitting it. Thank you for everybody. You've been doing a great job. I'll go over some of the most frequently incorrect answers in your notes as I go through what we study. So, Chapter 20, Section 1. Columbus took three ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Super important to history nerds for you to get the pronunciation of Nina right. It's got one of those squiggly lines over the M, so what are you going to do? So the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Columbus got these given to him by Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain to go explore. In what compass direction? Well, that's your next blank. West. So Columbus went west. A lot of people got that wrong. You couldn't really get the sense of what I was looking for. That's fine. No problem. They left in the summer of 1492. Of course, they did that partly because that's when the Reconquista had ended. Ferdinand and Isabella's attempt to reconquer Spain from Muslims and from the Jews. So he thought he'd landed in Indonesia, but in reality, he landed in the Caribbean. Now, he called the people that he met Indians because he thought he was in India and Indonesia, but in fact, the people that he'd met, and a lot of you got this wrong, that's fine, I was looking for something really specific. The people that he met were the Taino people, Taino. He captured every island that he came across. He went back to Spain, was given more money, more ships, because the first expedition was successful, and Columbus got 1,000 soldiers and 17 ships with the goal of establishing colonies for Spain. In 1500, Portugal sent a guy named Cabral. A lot of you got that wrong because you were looking at the earlier parts of his name, Pedro Alvarez de Cabral. Cabral is how he's generally known. He went west to make new discoveries. He found this super important giant country with a massive river in it, Brazil. So he found Brazil. Amerigo Vespucci explored a few years later. He probably was the first explorer to realize that he wasn't in Asia, that he was discovering something entirely new. And so a map maker who worked a couple of years after Amerigo Vespucci decided to name this new world for Amerigo, America. Early in the 1500s, Spain sent out Vasco de Balboa. And again, this is another name that some of you got wrong, Balboa, because you picked an earlier part of his name. He had like 7 names, and the textbook has a bunch of them in there, so Balboa. He explored around Panama. He was probably the first European to ever see the Pacific Ocean. A few years later, Ferdinand Magellan. Magellan led a small fleet that was the first one to go all the way around, which is circumnavigate the globe. He died on the way. 92% of his fleet sailors did. Really, it was one ship that made it back, but that one ship that successfully made it back full of supplies and spices paid for the entire voyage, and then some. Massive profit margin for Europeans. Mexico. Hernan Cortez landed with a small group of soldiers off the coast of Mexico in 1519 with the goal of conquering new lands. The invaders, these Spaniards, were known as conquistadors. They marched inland and found the capital city of the Aztec Empire, Tenochtitlan. The Aztec leader Montezuma thought that these gold-hungry, long-lost gods had come back to rule their world, and so they were loyal to them for a while. The Spanish murdered a whole bunch of Aztec warriors when they objected to being treated badly by their gods, and then the Aztecs decided they weren't really gods. These Spaniards were invaders, so they kicked them out. But Cortez came back later with a much bigger Spanish force, better weapons. They won because of those better weapons, because they found Aztec enemies to buddy up with. And so they were able to conquer the Aztecs pretty quickly. But probably the biggest reason is one that we are totally unfamiliar with, have no current experience with: disease, right? The Aztecs got sick with this horrible disease that wiped out a huge percentage. We're talking like really, really big percentage of the Aztecs because they just didn't have any kind of immunity. Not that we know anything about that in today's world, right? So it's thought that the native population of Mexico dropped from about 25 million people when the Spanish first got there to around 1 million about 80 years later. That's way bigger than anything we've ever experienced today, even coronavirus. Peru. The Spanish did not just stop at Mexico. The Peruvians, the Incas, the people that lived in Peru, had just been through a nasty civil war. There were two factions of the country led by separate brothers. Atahualpa was the winner, and as I mentioned in class, the winner gets to drink wine out of the skull of his defeated opponent, and so Atahualpa drank wine out of his brother's skull. Shortly thereafter, the Spaniards came under Francisco Pizarro. The Spanish forced the Incas to give them literally 24 tons of gold and silver to save their emperor's life. They did. They filled up an entire palace room with gold and silver, and then the Spanish murdered the emperor anyway. You know. They took the capital city. A few of you got the capital city of the Inca Empire wrong. It's Cuzco. C-U-Z-C-O. The Spanish took over the area partly by having male Spanish settlers move in to conquer everything. These people were called peninsulares. They set up the Spanish culture, they set up the religion, and they had mixed race children with native women, and they then raised those children who were called mestizos as Spanish-type people. The natives were forced to work pretty much as slaves in a system that was called the encomienda system. The Portuguese explorer, back to this guy, Cabral, right? Cabral, he had sailed west. He found that giant country with a huge river, Brazil. So Cabral found Brazil and discovered that sugar was there. So he reaped a whole bunch of sugar, brought it back to Europe, and we've all been addicted ever since. The new wealth flooding into Spain meant that Spain had a golden age of art and culture, as well as massive increases in spending. Their military became practically unbeatable because of the huge infrastructural investment from all of this transatlantic trade. The Spanish found Florida in 1513 under Ponce de Leon, and around 1540, a guy named Francisco Vasquez de Coronado explored the south central part of what we now call the USA. He was in Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, even like Oklahoma. So he explored a whole bunch of the Southwest. They created a new territory called New Mexico, and the capital was Santa Fe. They had a heavy focus in Spanish America on converting the natives to Christianity. Now, the slavery that was set up in that encomienda system was harshly criticized. A lot of Spanish people didn't approve of slavery, so they criticized the encomienda system. A really famous guy, a monk, named Bartolome de las Casas, really criticized the way that Native Americans were being used as slaves, the way that they'd become depressed and sad. And as a result of his campaigning to stop slavery of Native Americans, he advocated, and the Spanish government decided to do slavery of Africans instead. And everything went great after that, right? So we have massive influxes of slaves being brought from Africa because they really were already used to the Spanish diseases. All the European exposure that they'd had already meant that they didn't get sick and die of smallpox like Native Americans did all the time. So it was, plus another advantage that the Spanish had from bringing Africans was that if a Native American slave ran away and hid out in a community of Native Americans, you can't tell who he is. But if you bring somebody in from Africa and he runs away, doesn't really look like a lot of Native Americans. And so, yeah, easy to find, easy to recapture. The natives frequently rebelled against Spanish rule, starting with even the very first explorer, Columbus. Natives rebelled against Columbus in 1493. The biggest native rebellion against the Spanish was probably in about 1680, when Pueblo warriors, this was a blank a lot of you got wrong. You put natives, you put American Indians. Looking for a little more specifics here, the Pueblo Native Americans rebelled. 8,000 Pueblo warriors, led by a man named Pope, successfully held off the Spanish invaders for 12 whole years. So, not bad. I'm going to move on now to Chapter 20, Section 3, which was about the slave trade. Oh, so happy content, right? Europeans wanted sugar and tobacco from the Americas. The natives that the Europeans had first enslaved died too easily, too quickly. Died from depression, died from being torn away from their home, died from the diseases that the Europeans were bringing. So the Europeans turned to, Africa to get more slaves. African slavery had been common ever since the Muslims had started taking slaves in Africa who weren't Muslim. It's against the Muslim rules to enslave another Muslim, but anybody else, they're fair game. So the Muslims enslaved a whole lot of Africans who weren't Muslim. Most of these slaves were not treated horribly, though. They were not worked to death. They were not treated like savages. African slaves were, as I said before, immune to European diseases. So they were going to be fine with not dying quite as quickly. They were used to farming, and so they weren't living a whole new lifestyle in slavery a lot of the time. They didn't know where to go if they tried to escape, and they stood out in a crowd of natives. They were easier to recapture if you bring them over to Spanish America. From 1500 to 1700, that's 200 years, the Europeans, and this is a blank a lot of you got wrong, Europeans brought 1.3 million slaves from Africa. A lot of you put 17 million. That's the number that the Muslims had taken from Africa. The number of slaves in the Muslim Empire was 17. But the Europeans, during a 200-year period, brought 1.3 million slaves from Africa. And by the time we had the American Civil War in the 1800s, we and the Europeans had ended up bringing 10 million slaves over from Africa. Massive numbers. At first, the slave trade was mostly run by the two countries that had explored first, Spain and Portugal. However, by 1690, England had taken over. They won a couple of colonial wars against the Spanish and the Portuguese and took over those trade routes, forced them to give up the money-making trade routes. Wow. If you're going to trade money for morality, I guess. So, the British abolished slavery in 1807 and stopped being part of the slave trade in 1807. That's about 60 years before America was able to stop. The 400,000 slaves that they brought to America grew by 1830 to become 2 million slaves. The English brought over 400,000, and through reproduction, it became 2 million. Many of the slaves brought from Africa to America had originally been taken captive by other African tribal chiefs and then sold off to the Europeans. So, eventually, some African rulers banned the selling of slaves, but there were still African smugglers who defied their tribal chiefs and their kings and still continued to sell European slaves, even though they shouldn't have. The slave trade was just one leg of what's called the trade triangle. Trade triangle was hugely important. Europeans were bringing finished products from Europe to Africa, selling them in exchange for slaves, bringing the slaves over to North and South America, where they would get natural resources for the Europeans that they would then put on boats, and the Europeans would sail them back to Europe so they could not be natural resources anymore to be turned into finished products that would then get sold to Africa. So it's a whole trade triangle: Europe to Africa, Africa to America, America back to Europe. Every leg they're sending something different. So Europeans sold the finished goods in Africa in exchange for the slaves, sailed to America, sold the slaves in exchange for raw materials like sugar and rum, wood, stone, and those things were then brought back to Europe and turned into other things in the last leg of the trade triangle. The most horrible part of the whole system was what's called the Middle Passage. Remember, it starts in Europe when you bring the finished goods, so the Middle Passage is the part where you're sailing from Africa to the Americas with the slaves on board. The slaves were just packed in completely inhumane conditions that included starvation, beatings, exposure to life-threatening diseases in really, really enclosed conditions. And sadly, conditions really didn't get any better after they came to the Americas. They got sold, families were split up, some slaves escaped, others desperately tried to hang on to local traditions. They tried to hang on to their African names, their African lifestyles as much as they could, the music, and others just took part in violent uprisings occasionally. Now, the packet has got one of my absolute favorite paintings of all time. I'm going to show you a picture of this. Here's the painting. And this painting is by J.M.W. Turner. He was English. If you want to see the painting yourself, it's in Boston. It really is amazing. I've stood in front of that painting countless times telling high school students, friends, loved ones about the story behind that painting. When you look at it, it was painted at a time when the English were reconsidering getting back into slavery. And the problem was that this artist knew that slavery was absolutely the wrong thing to do. He'd heard stories about slave ship captains who would push slaves overboard to get the insurance money. Because if you had insurance on your slaves and they died on the ship because you starved them to death or because they got infected and sick with some disease, you didn't get a cash payment for them if you were the slave ship captain. The only way you could get money for them is if they fell overboard during a storm. And so slave ship captains would wait until a storm was coming through and get all of the slaves who were either already dead or about to die from starvation or sickness or depression or all the kinds of things that can kill you, put them on the top deck and literally shove them overboard in order to be able to collect on the insurance money. So, obviously, horrific. And this painting, The Slave Trader in a Storm, is a depiction of slaves in the water. At first, it just looks like this beautiful impressionist painting, but there's hands reaching up from the water, and they've still got shackles on them. There's sharks and other fish that are jumping in the water to come and kill these people that have just been pushed overboard for the insurance money. So, yeah, incredibly powerful painting. Next time you get the chance to go to Boston, if the museum's ever open again and life returns to normal, please see it. J.M.W. Turner, The Slave Ship in a Stormy Sea. Incredible. For hundreds of years, Africa continued to lose huge parts of their population. The guns that Europeans brought over did a huge amount of damage to Africa as well. Africa's loss, though, was America's gain. It's horrible to say and horrible to think, but America wouldn't be where it is without the incredible sacrifices of these slaves who didn't do it by choice. We would not have grown in our agricultural system, our business, our industry, our population, had it not been for the slaves that we stole, that we tortured, and we sometimes worked to death. in order to build the great America so that we can have the American dream. That's it for Chapter 20, Section 1 and Chapter 20, Section 3. Next time we get together, we'll do more history, and this time it's going to be happier. So, really good to be with you for a little while. Thanks for listening, and take good care.